Hi, everybody. My name is Amy, and I will be giving this talk along with my co-authors here. So Bianca Fichera and Darcy Merlo are both Bachelor of Honors students in the Department of Geospatial Science with me. Erica Kuligowski is in the School of Engineering, and she's an expert in bushfire evacuation. So what we're going to talk to you today about is our experience in studying some of the maps that were used during the Black Summer bushfires in Australia. Black Summer was an event that happened in the summer of 2019 and 2020. So bushfires are a recurring threat to the population across much of the continent of Australia. You probably have seen some of the coverage of this particular event because it was so extreme. Climate change is making fire an even bigger problem than it typically has been in the country. Its effects on our weather patterns have been making the worst fire weather days really hotter and more frequent. So in the 2019-2020 summer, Australia suffered one of its worst fire seasons on record, and large numbers of people and property were at risk. The fires were notable not only for their size, but also for the intensity with which they burned. There were really significant impacts on lives and property. Unfortunately, 33 people perished in the fire. More than 3,000 homes were destroyed and more than 24 million hectares were burned. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that sort of number in your head, that's an area almost the size of the state of Kentucky. Significant portions of the country were also affected by smoke from these intense fires for long periods of time, for several weeks to months even. Some 80% of the country's population was affected by the smoke, and there were an estimated 3,340 excess hospital admissions and 1,373 excess emergency room visits than we would have expected in normal times. So these events are more likely to become frequent with a warming climate. So we really need to be smart in Australia about how we manage the impacts while we're hoping that climate change mitigation efforts will eventually reduce the frequency and severity of these fires. The fires are often behaving in unpredictable ways, meaning that timely and accurate information is really critical to saving people's lives. And bushfire emergency mapping apps have become an important tool that emergency managers have used to communicate with the public. But little is known about who uses these apps, when they use them, for what purpose they use them. And the information needs among different groups also vary. So for example, local residents versus tourists that might be holidaying in the area. So our talk presents some preliminary results from a pair of studies that we've conducted that they're aimed to understand the context in which people are using these apps and what information that they're seeking when they use them. This slide also just kind of shows you how extensive the fires were and the severity of them. So you can see that most of the eastern seaboard was affected. Okay, so just a little bit about emergency management in Australia. States have the primary responsibility for emergency management. We don't have a national emergency mapping app at the moment. We did have one at one point in time. It was launched in 2011, but it's now been discontinued. And the federal government's role is really mostly in setting policy and funding programs. So operationally, the states are taking action on disasters. So in theory, we have a national symbol set that was introduced after these Black Summer fires, and this is what the fires, the symbols are meant to look like. So these are for warnings as you go from yellow to red, it's increasing in the sort of urgency of action that we're asking people to take. But in practice, when you look at these symbols, we don't actually see them applied uniformly across the states. In fact, none of them at the time of the Bushfire Royal Commission report written on these fires used that symbol set. And sometimes even the small differences in symbols can be confusing for people who are traveling, right? So for example, in New South Wales, you can see that the advice fires are blue. In Victoria, where I live, they're yellow. So, when you're traveling in an unfamiliar place, you might not really understand what these symbols mean. We've also looked at what's happened with these symbols after they were supposed to be implemented. This is a screenshot from from this week of what the app looks like in Victoria. And the first thing, when you look at this set of icons on this map, because Victoria's map is an all hazards map, It has more than 50 symbols, and some of them are animated in the explanation and the legend, basically. And they're not, you can't look at them long enough to actually interpret them if you don't know what they mean already. So there's obviously some problems there. And even so, they're not really the agreed national symbol everywhere. Just to give you an example of what this looks like on the actual maps themselves, you can see a screen grab on the left here from fires near me in New South Wales, where we have fires being depicted still in blue. You can see in Vic Emergency, where we don't have the fire symbol itself being used, but instead these exclamation point icons. And another difference is that in New South Wales, they're actually attached to the fires, whereas in Victoria, they're attached to areas. And in South Australia, you can see at the far left here, they just have the area symbol, but no icon at all. And it's not even quite the right color because they have given it some transparency so that you can see what's underneath. So, we're telling people to interpret these maps that are kind of complex, oftentimes in situations of stress. What's being depicted and how it's being depicted is varying among the states. And we think that that's perhaps a problem. So what do we know about how people use these maps? We know that users expect that these apps are going to provide them with all the needed information when they're in an emergency in terms of what decisions they need to make. The reality of the maps, however, is that the maps often stop at the state border. They're updated at different intervals. Sometimes they're updated more than once a day. Sometimes they're only updated once a day. Different states use different processes to update their maps. So people, if they have expectations of the app behaving in a particular way, might find that if they're in another state, it behaves a different way. They take different amounts of time in terms of the backend processes for them to be updated. So even if there are staff available and knowledge available to update these maps, it can also be, they can be a variable currency, let's say. And finally, damage to telecommunications infrastructure can hamper the person who's using the app actually receiving a timely update, even if the map has been updated on the server. So this is also a problematic aspect of the maps as they are. Okay, so now I'm going to let my students actually tell you about the results of their study. So we'll start with the study of local residents.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Bianca Fichera and my part of the study is researching bushfire mapping responses by local residents. So the questions included in our survey include characteristics like home characteristics, so length of residence, distance from town. We also looked at bushfire experience, so use of bushfire plan or the use of bushfire maps and apps. Then we looked at impressions of bushfire emergency mapping apps, so did they think the information was accurate and up to date? Then we also looked at demographic questions, so simple things like age, gender, and level of education. And it is noted that the last two categories are common with both studies. Okay, so the sampling frame of this study is local residents of bushfire-prone areas in Victoria, Australia. So bushfire-prone areas tend to be in the regional areas of Victoria. Despite previous bushfires and the known risks to bushfires, the population of regional areas continue to grow. So the population of regional Victoria from 2016 is 1,458,000 and is estimated to increase by approximately 710,000 people from 2015 to 2050. Okay, so how did we actually identify the people at risk? So what we did is that we conducted a screening survey to find participants that reside within bushfire-prone areas. So to do this in the screening survey, participants were asked to access the Vic Plan website where they entered their address, as you can see on the left there. And then once they entered it, the participants then had to look if the bushfire management overlay was displayed in the property information tab for their address, which is seen on the right. So if the BMO layer appeared in the tab, then the participant qualified to access the main survey as the house is considered to be in a bushfire-prone area. Okay, so we had around 500 people that completed the screening survey on Prolific, although only 23 were eligible for the main survey, with just 22 people actually completing the main survey. So we are now working on more targeted recruitment through social media channels such as Facebook in communities known to be at risk. So the location of these 22 participants is shown on the map to the left there, with their postcodes highlighted in red. So as you can see, they mainly reside in regional areas of Victoria, with a few on the border of metropolitan Melbourne. So the demographics of the 22 participants include that half of the participants were between 18 to 30 years old, with no participants above 70 years old. The gender was relatively equal, with females just being slightly higher. And lastly, most participants completed secondary school as their highest level of education. So the results, so some interesting results from the 22 responses were that 5 out of the 22 participants have never used an emergency application before. And the main reasons that they stated were that they do not know how to use them, they did not know they exist, and they actually found no need to use them. So another one is that only 9 out of the 22 participants received bushfire warnings from an emergency mapping application. This is interesting because while 77% of the participants have used emergency mapping apps, only 50% of them have actually used them to receive bushfire warnings. Okay, so in terms of participants' impressions of bushfire mapping apps, most participants responded with believing that bushfire emergency mapping apps give mostly accurate information. And similar to this, most participants responded with believing these apps only have a slight delay when showing up-to-date information. So one thing I found interesting was that the only participant to answer both slightly accurate and a long delay was also the only participant to use the app daily. So kind of makes us question there if they've got more experience with the app. So, you know, do they have a different view on the app than other participants may have? Okay, so some of the free text comments that we received from the question, what do you suggest would improve bushfire emergency apps, include some of the interesting ones that the last one there, so the notification feature is already helpful, but if it could immediately navigate to directions on what to do in emergency when pushed, that would be helpful. And that's somewhat similar to someone suggesting that they show all major and open roads to take to get away from fires. And then there were a few comments there about internet access. So people worried about how they would use the app if there was no internet access. Okay.
So that was our first study. Our second study was looking at emergency app usage among tourist populations.
To begin the survey, we asked participants about their trip or trip they plan to take, information like where and when they went, who they went with, as well as inquiring whether or not it was affected by bushfires. The next section was about their travel habits, inquiring about if they use any bushfire mapping applications and which ones they use, as well as the decisions they make after using these apps. And also asking if they use them before or during their trips. We then asked about the apps they used, asking how they feel about them and what suggestions they have in order to improve these apps. The end of the survey contained basic demographic questions, such as age, gender, their level of education, as well as their past experiences with bushfires. In order to obtain participants who were eligible for the study, there was a screening question asked. If they were planning to travel around Victoria during the 2019-2020 summer, people were deemed eligible to participate. We had a total of 530 people respond to this question, of which 196 were eligible to move on to the survey. And after filtering out any people who either didn't respond, didn't fully complete the survey, or completed surveys that contained unusable data, there were a total of 151 usable completed surveys. And of the participants, we can see that there were slightly more females, as well as the majority of them being aged between 18 and 30 years old. From the data collected, these graphs show a breakdown of how accurate and up-to-date the participants believed the bushfire emergency apps they viewed are by age. To ask this question, we used a scale, and using the accuracy question as an example, we scaled it from not accurate at all to slightly accurate, then mostly accurate, and then completely accurate, with the question regarding how up-to-date the information is being similar. with the majority of all age groups finding them either mostly accurate or with a slight delay. However, a bigger proportion of younger people tended to believe information was updated immediately. In terms of accuracy, most age groups had similar views on this. This graph shows how many people had used various emergency applications, with around 60% of people having used the Vic Emergency app. We can see here that 45 participants had never used any of these applications before. With around 45 never having used them, that means around 2/3 had used some form of emergency mapping applications before. And looking further at these 45, a total of 39 did not know these maps even existed, with a handful of others not knowing how to use them, or for other reasons, such as simply not feeling the need to use them. Finally, here are some of the more frequent suggestions for improving these applications. For example, asking for more targeted alerts for a location they are planning to visit, or more information of where the data is sourced, or providing users with alternate roads to get out of or around affected areas. And as you can see, road closures and detour information was suggested a number of times. The most common response for these apps was for these apps to have faster and more frequent updates. And it was interesting to see some people asking for more promotion and advertisement, considering the number of people who hadn't used these apps before. Some of the other more common suggestions were for things like improved user interface and improved notifications and alerts. Overall, I think we had some really interesting results, and it was definitely interesting to see the public's view on these emergency mapping applications.
Okay, so in just sort of summarizing and comparing some of the things that we found across the two studies, the local residents who lived in the bushfire risk zones were more likely to know about and to use the map app than tourists, with about 7% higher use rate in the local resident group compared to the tourist group. We found that tourists might know about the apps, but they might not be aware of relevant functions like setting alert locations. In the free text responses of the tourist respondents, there were quite a number of people who voiced a desire to be able to set an alert location that was not their home location, and that actually exists in these apps, so they maybe just don't know how to find that within the app. So some more clear instruction about how one could do that might be helpful in the apps. It was interesting that there was more awareness among local residents about internet dead spots where there was no reception than among tourists. In the types of locations that tourists go to, just like where local residents live, there are often internet dead spots, but it appears that the tourists are sort of less cognizant of the fact that that might happen, and that might affect their use of the app. So it seems that there's a clear need to communicate more effectively about A, the fact that the apps exist, and also B, what the apps are useful for and what they're not useful for, in terms of understanding how frequently they're updated, whether you can get information that's useful and relevant if your internet connection is spotty, for example, and for what kinds of decisions they are relevant in making. There was also a desire for additional information to be integrated into these apps. Some suggestions that were commonly made were integrating these maps into tools that people already use, like Google Maps, adding fire prediction information, and adding information about road closures or suggested routes to evacuate a particular area. So in terms of our future work in this area, the emergency management authorities in Australia are intending to begin releasing fire prediction maps, what they call red maps, on a more systematic basis. Here you can see an example of one that was released during Black Summer. This has not been commonplace in Australia, but there's, I think, increasing political pressure for agencies to release these kinds of maps. And we really don't know how people will understand or use or respond to these maps because they are not certain. They are predictions, and they have varying levels of certainty, and so the trust that one should put in the information in these maps is variable. And so we are very interested in how people will understand these maps and whether they will understand that they are not certain predictions. So along those lines, we are planning to study some different design options that might help to promote good understanding of what the maps tell you, and what intended protective behaviors people should enact when they see those maps. All right, so we'd like to acknowledge Chloe Begg and John Gilbert. They helped us with some critical commentary on the design of our 2 survey questionnaires, and I'm happy to take your questions on Slack.